what is happening is this opulent class is trying to strip wealth from quote unquote the peasantry. So it's just going to be a binary level of wealth. You're either going to have super wealthy and ultra uber wealthy. Again, I call it opulent class, parasite class, whatever you like to term them. And then they're going to shove everybody else down into the peasantry class. And we are going to repeat serfdom once again. Now, the way they do that is they ride on top of natural cycles, which are hidden from most of the public or most of the general populace. Do not understand these cycles at all. This is a wealth extraction. So I'm wondering back through time, take it back to the Roman era. How many times has this wealth extraction occurred? Like how much was the general wealth spread across the planet in, say, 79 AD or something, 535 AD? And then how is it being consolidated?
The solar activity and the magnetic field is going to present itself in earthquakes and liquefaction. I think we're starting to see some of those elements happen right now in Australia in areas that don't traditionally have those. Well, traditionally, even according to the modern scholars of history, the breadbasket for the Roman Empire was always North Africa. It was a bountiful place where crops were constantly being rotated, and it was a perfect place. But at the same time, they're trying to push this idea that North Africa's always been a desert. It's always been inhospitable. But like you said, the Chinese seem to have their finger on the pulse of where to go, where to set up, where to invest for that long game to play out. Welcome to episode 28 of your Missen the Point podcast, where we discuss the weird, the wonderful, and the downright bizarre aspects of life. Today I'm joined by a man who has meticulously researched ancient civilizations, their collapse, and the inevitable conclusion that these events are trackable through energetic cycles of the Earth's sun. A man that provides information on what to expect during these societal resets and how to keep your family safe. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome host of Mini Ice Age Conversations podcast, David DuByne. Welcome, David.
Hey, thanks for having me on. We overlap on a lot of different ideas and the way that we see maybe history in a different timeline and where that takes us in the future and how these two might meet, because we're definitely going to have to rethink where we're going right now. And based on the past, we've seen collapse, reemergence, collapse, reemergence, and it looks like we're at another collapse phase. So looking at the past, how can we weave through this time of perceived danger and unknown and then really prosper and make our lives even better and help others come through this transition period here?
Absolutely. And I've got to say, starting off, it's an absolute honor to have you on the show, because I've been a listener of yours for the longest time now, and you're solely responsible for waking me up to these cycles of destruction that seem to be happening and kicking my ass into gear a little bit and getting myself prepared and starting preps and getting into permaculture and really starting to be more self-sufficient for what I see are going to be some very difficult times ahead.
And I have walked the talk. I ended up, after the COVID, buying a 23-acre farm out here in East Tennessee, and we put out 120 trees in the fruit orchard, for everything from plums to peaches, apples, pears. We have turkeys now. We started with chickens, but we moved to turkeys and geese. Those eggs are much more valuable. And some of these prices on the birds now, $30 to $50 per bird as a chick. So we're thinking, okay, we have plenty of protein from the chickens, but now what could we do to generate some revenue? Or thinking past money. And I'm encouraging everybody to think past money here, because we're going to move into sort of a barterable, tradable future. And what can you trade? I mean, you have your skills, obviously, that you can trade for something, but then what else? And we're just trying to think a little bit outside the box by now we have sheep as well. We have 3 sheep, and it just keeps moving on. We're trying to refurb the pond. There's a bunch of snapping turtles down there, huge amounts of fish. So we're trying to think many ways, shapes, and forms. And then the micro hydro is my newest thing. We have a couple streams on the property. They flow after it rains, and micro hydro is the way to go. So I'm trying to take a holistic view of, we're going to need to generate our own power or substitute it. We're going to have to substitute our own in the food chain or whatever you consume in your body. have access to fresh water with the well and the spring. Step back to the 1860s or 1850s. That's kind of where we're going back to. So what did a family cover of their own need that wasn't on a supply chain at that point? I mean, there were trains coming across the continents by 1860, 1870, but largely they were pretty self-sufficient except for the steel and the heavy tools and this sort of thing. So I'm, looking at that direction as a clue from the past on where we're going to go in the future here.
Yeah, it's very strange that in the span of maybe 2 or 3 generations, all the knowledge that the average person would have for themselves and the skill sets that every person could do, we've lost over time. It's a very strange time to be alive, that we have the collective knowledge of all of humanity at our fingertips, but we can't do the most simplest of things that our great-grandfathers could do.
I agree with you 100% on that. Now, think about how that was done. They used the human default of comfort as safety against us. Because if we want to talk about resets, the Younger Dryas, we had the cometary impact on an ice sheet. And you step back into the exit out of the last ice age where sea levels were rising. And, the most stable time, if you want to talk about ancient history, is after the glaciation would onset and the full glaciation was reached across the planet. You put this into perspective of our interglacial is only 10,000 years on average. But the full glaciation would have been 70,000 years of stable climate. So even though you might have thought an ice age, the whole planet's covered in ice. Well, not really. I mean, it went down to probably 30 north and 30 south. And then that band around from the equator up to those ice walls would have been stable for 70,000 years. So think about the societies that could have formed then. But coming out of this, for something about the Homo sapiens sapien, us, the human, default is safety and comfort, because there was so little of it through our past that whenever that zone was reached of being able to feed yourself, having enough safety for your family so you weren't either eaten or taken by rival tribes or rival civilizations or countries or quote unquote civilizations, whatever that would be. Once you found that zone where there was plentiful food, plentiful water, plentiful safety, you just stayed there because it was such a rare type of thing to come into. So use that against us now and create that ultimate soft zone, if you will. And then 3 generations of that were our baseline to survive. Is that? Well, yeah, you can see how that was easily pulled off. So the manipulators of the, let's say the ruling class, for a better word here, have taken that to the Uber, and they used our own default settings for survival against us to make sure that conditions were set that we don't survive, or the majority do not survive during this changeover, which makes me really sad, actually.
Yeah, it's this parasite class, to use our own creature comforts against us, is it's very evil and manipulative to the fact that they're playing a long-term game. They're playing a game hundreds of years in advance of what the average person knows. And that's what really astounds me about the work that you've done. You've researched what's been happening in these fourth turning type of situations, but it's not as simple as an economic collapse or a change in culture or a change of demographics. You've actually pinpointed it to real natural events in cycles that seem to topple these societies and these civilizations. Can you go into that a little bit, please?
Yeah, I would love to, but you framed it perfectly there. What is happening is this opulent class is trying to strip wealth from quote unquote the peasantry. So it's just going to be a binary level of wealth. You're either going to have super wealthy and ultra uber wealthy. Again, I call it opulent class, parasite class, whatever you like to term them. And then they're going to shove everybody else down into the peasantry class. And we are going to repeat serfdom once again. Now, the way they do that is they ride on top of natural cycles, which are hidden from most of the public or most of the general populace. Do not understand these cycles at all. So when you see these weather events coming in, and climate events, and I'll stay with that. I'll use the word climate. The cycles are known. So think about the power that you would have over society if you knew the onset dates of these cycles that would upset food production globally. The weather would change along with it. You would see superstorms, the jet streams would move into different positions, the cloud cells would move, and you'd have a terrified, unknown populace, because you can go back to the Mayan when they, understood the cycles of eclipses, and the priests would know in advance when the eclipses were coming, but nobody else did. So they were, we're going to make the sky black because you disobeyed us. And then in the morning from 901 to 905, the eclipse comes in. And they're like, get on your knees and worship us. We're going to make the sun come back. Everybody's quaking, we'll obey you now. And then we'll let the sun rise again. And then the eclipse is over. Like imagine the power you have. So if you knew a grand solar minimum was onsetting, the entry into it, what years would it onset? What years would it strengthen? And then what years would it be most obvious to the public where you could no longer hide it? And then what would be the ramifications of full max effect on geomagnetic, planetary, within the solar system itself, but also on the Earth, the magnetic field, the change in the human behavior pattern based on magnetic field changes in our brains would also be mapped out. That would be part of it. The fear or the rewards, pushed, pulled. And, if you had this information of the onsets, and it only occurs every 400 years, and then there's max, they call them super grand solar minimums, and it's a culmination of 5 of those 400-year cycles, so about a 2,000-year cycle. Trace that back, we got the start of a new religion around that same time period. So think about the power of control over society. You knew it was going to change anyway. You absolutely knew. Nothing you can do. Every society prior has collapsed. Not a thing you can do except protect yourselves. This is a wealth extraction. So I'm wondering back through time, take it back to the Roman era. How many times has this wealth extraction occurred? Like how much was the general wealth spread across the planet in, say, 79 AD or something, 535 AD? And then how has it been consolidated? And really, when we look and, they talk about the numbers of, the uber wealthy controls 60%, 1% of the population controls 60% of the wealth on the planet. Spin it back a few cycles of consolidation, and it was 1% of the population was a quote unquote the uber elite in the Roman era times only controlled like 10% of the wealth. And then each successive cycle, it gets more and more stratified and more consolidated. So I'm just wondering, where we sit at this point, because I assure you this elite, opulent parasite class is riding on top of a natural cycle to achieve a greater outcome while not sharing this knowledge with the public. So that's where I sit, and I have since pretty much the first months of doing the research on my channel when I started in 2014.
It's a scary thought that these megalomaniacs out there have got this knowledge. And like you said, they're using it to extract wealth. But there's also the more horrifying thing that these people, they suck out the wealth of society before this cycle comes to its final stages. And they will go and they'll position themselves somewhere in the world. They know they're going to be safe so they can come out afterwards when it's all settled and it's all said and done. And if the majority of society has been wiped out and taken back to, say, a Stone Age era and all the knowledge of what the world was like has been lost, think about what these people could set themselves up as. They could set themselves up as a priest class. They could even set themselves up as gods with the level of technology they would have in comparison. And like you said, maybe that's how they've started these religions and these ways of thinking in the past.
video. Yeah, but I think you misspoke there because you said these people. They're not people.
No, they're not.
They're not. You know, when you really look at it, there's a subhuman entity or something extra human entity within them, either inhabiting their psyche or maybe there's some cloaking device on the outside of them. But really, you have to look at it from just common sense. You don't do that to an entire species on the planet unless you're from another species. Because the way you look at an ant, like we got fire ants all over the place here on the property. So for me, when they get too close to the house or too close to the chickens or somewhere we're going to be, I put poison on them. You know, my place is one of the cleanest properties around here. Even the Amish, when they come up and visit, because we do a lot of business with them, they bring their horses up and I'm like, yeah, just let them graze out here. I don't spray anything. I go very, very, very little on anything poisonous except for the anthills, because they're really ferocious. You get bitten up by a bunch of fire ants, you're going to have a serious problem. I look at that as, well, they're just fire ants. So for me to pour a bunch of stuff on them to get rid of them or reduce the numbers of them, they're a different species. We can flip the mirror on that is whatever is or has been, like I say, survived these resets and popped out with their technology intact or semi-intact compared to the rest, is doing exactly that. I, have some thoughts going back circa 7 to 10,000 years prior, or even 30,000 years into the past, even 80,000. Because at 80,000 years, so put it in perspective here. The 10,000 years of warmth that we've in the interglacial has been a stable period of time for 10,000 years to do agriculture, etc. Into that last ice age from, say, circa 118,000, 108,000 years ago, that would have been solidly 10,000 years of stability by that point. So, there's talk of civilizations 80,000 years ago, et cetera, which makes sense because you would have stabilized the glacial ice sheets at that point 80,000 years ago, and you would have had 10,000 years of development. So whoever still controls this, and then what about the previous interglacials? Like, we never find any relics from 118,000 years ago, which was the last time it was 10,000 years of warmth. Were the same ones where they got into an area where they knew that the glaciation and the ice sheets wouldn't cover them and they would not be buried under ice. And then where are these zones? They have to be equatorial to 30 north or 30 south. I don't know, but it seems the same. Maybe it's not the same tech, but it's the same mind frame continues after 400,000 years or so. So I'm really into the thought that it's something non-human in the control mechanism right now.
It definitely seems that way. And seeing with the way that things are going at the moment, it's just for an Australian context, that I'm in Victoria, the southern tip of mainland Australia, and our capital city has had 3 earthquakes within the last week. That is completely out of odds for this type of landmass that we're on. We have no major fault lines across that area, and we've had a 3.8 followed by 2.3 magnitude tremors following it, all across areas where there are no traditional fault lines. And I know that what you've been talking about in a lot of previous shows, that the solar activity and the magnetic field is going to present itself in earthquakes and liquefaction. I think we're starting to see some of those elements happen right now in Australia in areas that don't traditionally have those.
And I'll point to another one in the mid-Atlantic. It's in the middle of a plate. They've had earthquakes out there too. So it seems to be happening in these middle of plate zones where there's no, obviously California, you got 2 plates. Asia, you have 2 plates coming in. But in the center of a plate, it's just not normal. And what can explain that? Electromagnetic activity. That's the only possible thing that can explain that. There's really nothing else. I mean, maybe there's a new punch through a volcano and you're suddenly going to get a volcano coming out near you somewhere. How terrifying would that be? A volcano opens under your feet and then it just keeps growing and growing and growing in the middle of like the trendiest neighborhood somewhere, like, hey, I'll have a double espresso and I'll watch the volcano grow for the next 20 minutes before I got to get into my cubicle. So,
well, they make some pretty good coffees in Melbourne, but I don't think they want them that hot.
Yeah, we don't know. Hey, let me ask you a quick question. I've been reading some reports. So since you're on the ground right there, a little bit chillier and wetter than normal this last 6 months, or is it, within what you remember, or how is it?
I was hoping you were going to bring this up because you were talking about some of these things happening long time before they actually happen. You seem to be right on the money with a lot of what the cycles you're seeing, and they're playing out as you've researched it. When the Honga Tonga volcano erupted and put all that ocean water up into the atmosphere, all of last summer, I can honestly say we did not have a summer in Australia. We had the wettest conditions to the point where all the crops that I'd put in either were ended up with root rot, or over 1 or 2 days where they got the smallest little bit of warmth, they instantly went to seed. They thought it was a season change that they need to quickly change and get their seeds out. So the crop yields were absolutely terrible within my own raised beds. But yeah, like you said, it's a lot wetter than it should be. And it's a lot colder than it should be. We didn't have a summer at the end of last year and the start of this year. So it'll be very interesting to see how the summer months in the later half of this year end up going. But so far, it's looking like your stereotypical wet winter that hasn't stopped since the end of last year when it should have been a summer.
So just to reference that for the Hunga Tonga eruption, if nobody's aware, it occurred, January 15th of 2022. It injected 10% more water vapor into the atmosphere, or moisture, if you like to term it as that, in a single event, in a single day. So we had 100% water in the atmosphere that could turn into rain and clouds and evaporation in the oceans. And then we just added 10% into a closed system in a single day. That is, he said, that'll be no effect. It'll just thin itself out. Okay. I'd like to have whatever you're having, because that's,
Well, the logical reasoning would be that you would have 10% increased on your wet seasons, or 10% extended time frame on what your wet seasons would be.
True. And, I've been looking at some of the crop data coming out of Western Australia, and they said that they had all-time bumper crops in Australia. And, they're claiming that it's the largest wheat yields ever. But the problem was they couldn't export it. And I'm like, well, wait a second. You're telling me that you can't export, but you have the largest yields ever, but you can't export any of it because of some bottlenecks with transportation and logistics. And I'm like, wait a second. Is that the cover story for why they can't export it? Or you just claim that there's record production? Because everywhere across every other country in the Southern Hemisphere, like, let's say you go to Brazil, or if you go to Argentina, and you go to Paraguay, and you go to South Africa, and any of these other places that are growing grains, they all struggled, and they were down some 30 to 40%. But magically, Australia, just record production when every other country doing grains in the same hemisphere, pretty much on the same latitudes, just struggled. And then the excuse was, well, we're having trouble exporting that out this year. So go figure.
Yeah, I think that's obfuscating the truth a little bit, where in the mainstream, they've kind of been peddling it to us Aussies that a lot of our trade happens with China. We're pretty much predominantly a food ball for Southeast Asia and mostly China. And our trade relations with China haven't been at the best for the past 5 years. So they're kind of saying that China's just not buying our grain. Now, both you and I know that China are buying up as much protein and as much food sources as they can. They know what's happening. The Chinese have seen this cycle play in and out for generations now. They know what's on the horizon. So it seems very odd for me that China would just neglect to buy food from Australia, who's closer to them, who supposedly got bumper crops. Why wouldn't they be buying it? So that kind of tells me they're saying that China's not buying it, but in fact, they don't actually have the crops that they say they do.
Yeah, because another thing, if you just look at pricing kept increasing for wheat through these times, even. So generally, when it came into the harvest season, it drops prices. There's a glut. And that's generally when countries like China would jump in on the buying arena and secure supply. But for prices not to dip with all-time record production, it really didn't make sense. There's like two different, if you just come from a fact-based perspective, if the prices actually rose when they're supposed to drop because of harvest based on the amount of harvest, and then China's not buying, and then you can't export for some reason, you just have to scratch your head and say, wait, what's really going on? Now, if I could throw a Chinese factoid in Australia to you here for a second, you got to take you back maybe 4 years. Now, they're up the area up at Cape York and Darwin, coming down into Darwin and a little bit off the East Coast going into the outback. They do a lot of cattle ranching up there, but it's been so dry for so long that a lot of farmers were giving up and, cashing out of their land. Well, unbeknownst, and then finally the news showed that China bought, 1 million acres up there, but they got a super incredible discount for it. It appeared as if it was going to continue to dry out, where the farmers weren't going to even be able to continue ranching because it was going to get so dry that they couldn't even feed the cattle up there. So China came in and swooped all that land up at a really incredible bargain, because they were saying, well, we'll help the economy, we'll keep some people there, we'll do construction, we'll do water projects, blah, 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 how China sells it. But then it started to rain now. And that's up there is now just verdant fields of grasses. Like, how did the Chinese know that that specific spot or on your continent or your country was going to come back green again in advance? That's what I'm saying. They really understand the cycles of where's going to be hit. There's going to be a movement of blocking patterns. So, an ice age, you might think like an ice age. Okay. How does it really work? Well, what happens, there's a blocking pattern that sets up for centuries and it never dissipates. So you'll get a high pressure system in an area that will stay there for 200 years and everything bends around it and it continues to dump snow in the exact same areas and it never moves and it never shifts. So if you also knew where these blocking patterns would start to set up, like we experienced one in the United States, which is taking our wheat production to 100-year lows here. This blocking pattern is pushing in drought for the last 4 years in the middle section of our grain growing areas in the heartland. Now, not so much up where they grow corn up near the Great Lakes, but all the way from Colorado down through Nebraska and the Panhandle there into northern Texas. And that whole area has just been bone, and I mean bone dry for years now because of the same blocking pattern that is set up during this La Nina for the third La Nina in a row. So you can actually see it in smaller time frames occurring. Now, can you imagine if it goes on centuries, not just a year? Like if that blocking pattern would continue if it were to continue for another 2 to 3 years, we'd be back into another Dust Bowl era.
Yeah, it's almost as if they've got the playbook and they know where the new grow zones are going to be or where the traditional grow zones used to be. There's a lot of history in North Australia where the Chinese actually traded with Indigenous Australians, and it goes back at least 60,000 years for as long as Indigenous people have inhabited this landmass. So you can quite easily say that the Chinese have had the finger on the pulse of what grow zones work well in what parts of Australia. But it even goes into an interesting point of fact that the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, where the Chinese are investing so heavily within Australia, South America, and Africa, buying out ports, investing in highways and railways. They're setting up the infrastructure for themselves so they can make sure they can remain fed in some kind of a calamity or like you said, potentially even another ice age event.
Yeah, that Shanghai Cooperation Agreement is the actual glue that sticks it all together. That is the bedrock of what we're seeing with the Belt and Road right now and the movement to the BRICS currencies. But North Africa, one of my favorites to talk about, and the Sahel, we go back on that cycle right there. And mega lakes in the middle of what we consider Chad and the southern parts of Libya, etc. Vast river systems, the Ghana kingdom from, say, 600 AD, controlling the gold and salt trade all through rivers, using rivers to move through. And then I was like, wait a second. No, hold on. I've seen a huge amount of maps from the 1500s that still show those same lakes and those same river channels and estuaries, full. They're blue on the maps. But they're telling us in traditional sciences that the last time there were mega lakes and any kind of rivers that could support trade at that level were some 6,000 years prior. I'm like, wait a second, cartographers, they were under penalty of death by faking anything that came out to return back to the monarchies and the royalty of the time. That was punishable by death if you were a cartographer and you had, quote unquote, faked the information, if it was not factual, because that's how they relied on trying to expand their kingdoms as well. And it could be anybody from England, France, Spain, whatever. But when you go back to that time, I believe the cartographers way more than I believe a history book. History is rewritten all the time, but those maps are literally a moment of time locked in stone, for a better term. If you see it on one map, that might be an anomaly. But routinely, on every map that you see in the 14 and 1500s, they have lakes and large lakes and river estuaries and all these things traveling through Africa. And another thing, they show incredible amounts of green in what is considered like the empty quarter of Saudi Arabia on the Red Sea. There would be Western Saudi Arabia, green all the way down where the Red Sea was. But this is the frankincense route. Again, you go back to the Aksum kingdom that controlled the gold trade right around the same time. So the Romans collapsed, let's say 535 or 500 AD. From that point to, like, say, 500 to 800 AD, there was another kingdom called Aksum, Axum, that had the most precise gold and silver weights that they took over from Rome, but they controlled the frankincense route. They controlled right now what we consider Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, that whole area all the way. And then they met and traded with the Kingdom of Ghana that controlled Central Africa all the way over to like places like you call Mauritania, Nigeria, etc. today. But they had this vast trade network, all powered by rivers. You know, you look at some of these old maps and the areas that are green, just massive amounts of like grasslands and, you know, subforests, etc. And there's really a couple missing pieces of history that we're looking at here. A, about the monetary base of things, but B, about how quickly climate systems can change. And then a history that we've been strictly lied to. But I find it interesting that wherever you look back on these maps, what is totally bone dry right now, China is on top of like a duck on a June bug, just like they were right over in Australia and, you know, Cape York, Darwin, Outback area. And they're doing it in the Middle East, North Africa, and the Sahel, because they know that cycle's coming back. And if I might interject one last point here, the West African monsoon is shifting also, and it's bringing more natural rainfall over Mauritania in, but for some reason it's missing Morocco. But from Morocco south all the way down, that area is getting more green just from natural rainfall. And China's been putting out a lot of infrastructure to try to tap the Nubian sandstone aquifer to bring up underground water resources. Now, and then you combine that with above ground precipitation increases, and then suddenly you can put a new grow zone out in the middle of what is now the desert. And then you could get a double rotation crop. And again, it's super cheap land. There's millions of square kilometers of crop production that it could be put online right there. So traditionally, China does lose its crop growing areas during these grand solar minimums. So if you were going to replace it, you got to start the Belt and Road. You control all the ports, all the money, all the rail lines. You control all the banking and the finance. Of course, you could get food grown in one region of the planet and have a continuous ant line of shipping back to your own nation.
Well, traditionally, even according to the modern scholars of history, the breadbasket for the Roman Empire was always North Africa. It was a bountiful place where crops were constantly being rotated, and it was a perfect place. But at the same time, they're trying to push this idea that North Africa's always been a desert. It's always been inhospitable. But like you said, the Chinese seem to have their finger on the pulse of where to go, where to set up, where to invest for that long game to play out.
Well, it's been like that. Think about the Silk Road, traditional Silk Road camels, etc., going all the way from, you know, Xinjiang over in the western areas of China, transiting through Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and then popping out over in Istanbul and Turkey. Okay, now do that for 4,000 years. You're certainly going to understand how the climate had shifted just along that route in the northern areas there. But unbeknownst to everybody, there was a southern Silk Road, which also, but they didn't use camels there because it went through Yunnan up through northern Myanmar, over through India, and then it reconnected back up somewhere through Afghanistan, and then it popped back into Central Asia. That was called the Southern Silk Road. But then they also had a maritime Silk Road, which was just using the coastlines coming through the Malacca Straits and then following. And once it popped out there, then, you know, jump over to Sri Lanka and then up. Do that for 4,000 years. You would understand the climate system through the northern part of Asia, the southern parts of Asia, and then also the way that the oceans would behave. You would have it mapped out. You would definitely know again and again. And if let's use the 400-year timeline, that gives you 10 different iterations. Chinese kept meticulous notes. If you think the British Navy was meticulous, no way. They were sloppy kindergartners compared to Chinese maritime and what they reported back to the emperors at times like this. So they're for sure understanding the changes are here again, and they're trying to protect themselves from another downfall or collapse of a dynasty, the Xi dynasty.